Welcome to Project Natter. This is Black Lives Marxists Part 3. Joining me is London-based activist and former UKIP leader Richard Braine. Before we get started, if this is your first time here, please show your support for freedom of speech by clicking that subscribe button.
Three, two, one, and we are live. Welcome, Richard.
Hi, David. Good to see you again. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it. So this morning I head down to central London to go and take a look at Churchill. It's literally in a box. They've boxed up our history. Cenotaph is in a pretty similar condition. What do you make of it all?
I think it's just an absolute disgrace, and I'm absolutely convinced that the majority of people in this country are horrified to see Winston Churchill in Parliament Square inside a box because the police either don't want to or think they are unable to defend an important sculpture in the centre of our capital city, 100 yards from our Parliament. It's just mind-boggling. It's a complete disgrace. Winston Churchill should be on display for people to see and enjoy, and to remind everyone of how important it was to fight fascism and beat fascism. And he was someone who warned this country for many, many years about the rising threat of Nazism in Germany, and had the guts to face up to it and knew what to do about it. And I think that he certainly contributed a vast amount to the morale of Britain when we were facing the bleakest times you can imagine. It really was us against, for 2 years or so, it was us against a combined fascist Nazi Europe. And so his contribution is enormous. And for so-called anti-fascists to be defacing Winston Churchill's statue is just a mind-boggling hypocrisy. And the way the protesters, I call them protesters, they're just thugs. They really are left-wing fascist thugs. And people will raise an eyebrow at the expression left-wing fascist, but almost all of the features of fascism are present, almost all are present in groups like Antifa and Momentum and the extreme far left that we see in this country and in the US today. So I call them left-wing fascists very consciously because they rely on intimidation and violence and threats and shutting down other people's speech. And those are the methods that the fascist thugs used back in the 30s. So we've seen it before. But I don't think the people of this country are cowed by it. And I think that the people of this country want our Prime Minister to take charge of the situation and to make sure that police and possibly even the military, if necessary, actually defend these important landmarks and important examples of our history and reminders of our history. History we can be very, very proud of indeed, because fighting against the German Nazis was a very important and brave and ultimately successful thing to do. And my own father is 95 years old, and he was in the North Atlantic and North Russia. He was at D-Day in the Royal Navy. He was in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and also the Far East. So he really covered the whole world during the war as a naval officer. And throughout that period, every night probably his life was on the line. There was a lot of shipping sunk. Half of his class at Dartmouth didn't make it through that war. Those were his friends, and he risked his life for many years to fight fascism. He also voted Leave, by the way. And the idea that these youngsters who have been brainwashed into believing in this sort of bogus, discredited, hopeless left-wing ideology that killed 100 million people in the 20th century, as if it's going to somehow this time work, which they all seem to think they found some magic way of making an unworkable ideology work. The idea that they're contributing anything to this society with these riots and these attacks on the police is absolutely absurd and obscene. So Winston Churchill should be visible in Parliament Square. There should not be a box around him, and the police should be making sure that he is protected and not defaced by these thugs.
we also see, the cenotaph, as I mentioned, that's also got a board around it now. It's about 6 foot high. It's not very high. I mean, my nan could probably climb over it if she wanted to. So if the protesters turn up and want to vandalise it, I'm sure they can still. But we are expecting to see quite a few people from right across the UK. So we know that there are like veterans turning up, football fans, motorcycle clubs, and various different patriots. And I've seen online lots of families have been upset that the cenotaph was vandalised, because obviously it represents all of our glorious dead, which are people from all colours who've fought and died for our freedoms and our democracy, and seeing that's they sort of I don't think they really realise how upset the nation is by their actions. I've seen Sadiq Khan tweeted just before we started this video, telling people not to attend the Black Lives Matter protest tomorrow because the far right are going to be in town. When in fact, there might be some small elements to that, but there was a large group, shall we say, of people that will be heading down there, whose families, like you just said yourself, your father was in the Navy or not. He fought during the war, and there's people whose sons who have died in action, and they've just seen the cenotaph been vandalised, and that cenotaph, represents the sacrifice that their sons have made.
Yeah. I agree 100%. I sent a tweet out a couple of days ago saying that I would not be going, even though I live quite close. I would not be going to Parliament on Saturday because it seems likely to me that when you consider that the BBC described what happened last weekend as largely peaceful, and we've all seen the videos of people hurling bicycles at police horses, and I think 30 or 40 policemen were injured, and that's largely peaceful apparently. Those people are thugs, violent thugs, and they don't care about democracy. They want to get their way through intimidation, which is what thuggery is about. And so if the BBC can report it so dishonestly, it's so disgusting how they reported it. I mean, I've obviously not been a fan of the BBC for a long time, but that I think that was a new low for the BBC. Absolutely revolting for a £4 billion a year tax-funded broadcaster to be taking a highly partisan position for a small minority of people protesting about an incident that occurred 4,000 miles away in another country and has very little significance to us. Although the only connection really is that white people are in more peril than black people in police custody in the US, just as they are in the UK. The numbers show that actually the police treat black people better than they do white people in both the US and the UK. But leaving that issue aside, the BBC's reporting is so bad and the rest of the media is so bad that I took the view that turning up tomorrow almost certainly would be exploited by the press. There would be agitators in there trying to make sure there was trouble so that they get their story, and they'll probably just make it up in Photoshop and in the story. Oh, here are your Nazis, and of course it's a load of rubbish, because there really isn't any sensible, organized extreme right or far right in this country. It's a myth. The far left controls this country. It's thoroughly infiltrated every institution in this country, and the far right doesn't exist. And so that's why Sadiq Khan's words today ring so false, because everybody knows it's rubbish. There are millions of people across this country who are perfectly moderate, normal, decent people who do not wish to see Winston Churchill's statue defaced and vandalized by extremist thugs. And that doesn't make them far right. So I'm absolutely incensed by what Sadiq Khan has said. And after he's run for 4 years his great Stabathon, where he introduced policies that massively increased street crime, and especially knife crime against immigrant victims, in fact. So it's a pretty racist policy that he's introduced. And now we see this, which is another extremely racist attitude being taken by him against the ordinary folk of this country. So I'm disgusted by it. but having seen him put boxes around the cenotaph and Churchill, and also seen him calling off his brown shirts by saying to his followers in Black Lives Matter and Antifa, don't come along to cause another riot tomorrow. And I think what he's actually concerned about is that the police will have enough good, decent people there that the riot will be controlled, and they'll have to actually arrest a lot of the troublemakers. So I think that may be what it's about. But I think also they worked out that last weekend, while they had a lovely time beating up policemen and animals, of course, they realised that despite the efforts of the BBC, most people in this country look at what they did last week and just think that they're mindless thugs, and it doesn't help promote their extreme left ideology, and it doesn't help promote their cause. So I suspect that's the real reason why Sadiq Khan has called off his brown shirts tomorrow, and yeah, so that's why maybe go along tomorrow, because if Antifa aren't turning up, David, can you still hear me? Because I've just lost my camera.
I'll
just carry on for a second, and I'll put a battery in. But so yeah, maybe turn up tomorrow, because it looks less likely that there'll be trouble, because Sadiq Khan has stood down his followers in Antifa and Black Lives Matter, essentially terrorist organizations, as far as I can work out. But he seems to have some control of them, or he seems to be able to speak to them directly. So that's it.
In the last video I did with David Vance gave a great example of the media bias by saying, basically, imagine if a load of protesters were to turn up to the BBC headquarters and turn up, smash everything up, and 30 or 40 odd BBC staff were injured. Would the BBC report a mostly peaceful protest?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, they ought to, considering what they were trying to get away with last week. So, yeah, it's disgusting, and I mean, the BBC are just a complete disgrace, and have been for a long time. So, that's exactly right. What do you make of the statues and that being removed, Richard? What's your view on these statues? Do you think that they should be removed? Do you think that they should be replaced? Because we saw a couple of days ago there was a protest outside Oxford. You saw the video that I posted. It's gone viral now, of two guys there protesting. They didn't even know who Rhodes was, but they wanted the statue removed. But who would they replace the statue with? Robert Mugabe? Yeah.
What's your take on it?
My take on it is that it's difficult to judge people from the distant past by today's standards. I think that our history has become very distorted because people primarily concentrate on the horrors and the evil, and there's almost no accounting in history for. I mean, there's a bit of accounting, there's a lip service to the good that's done by large numbers of people. So I think that it's not worth going through some kind of inquisition against statues of this kind. I mean, it mentioned the Inquisition. The Inquisition killed about 4,000 people over 400 years. So on average, it is 1/20,000th as lethal to people as Islam over 1,400 years, which Islam each year or over that period has killed 20,000 times as many. So we need to get these things in perspective. The slave trade existed long before Europeans turned up, both in Africa and in India, and probably many other places in the world. It's not documented. The anthropological record has large numbers of broken human femurs, and no one could understand why until someone pointed out that they didn't have refrigeration. So what they were doing was capturing people from neighboring villages or tribes or countries, and then taking them back and then breaking their legs so they couldn't go anywhere, so that you could keep them fresh, feed them a bit, and then when it was time to chop them up and stick them in a pot, that's what you would do. And that's how they made sure they had fresh meat. And some people think that that's a significant reason why the human brain grew. The runaway brain grew so much because of cannibalism, slavery. Cannibalistic slavery. So the history of slavery goes back a long time, probably a million years, who knows. And what's extraordinary about Britain, this country, and why we can be so proud of it, is that we've actually done more than any other country in the world to bring the slave industry, which has existed probably forever, to a halt. And we should be very proud of that. So we shouldn't be made to feel guilty about that. We participated in existing slave markets and certainly took an industrial approach to them. And large numbers of slaves were transported. But it's also remember that the Kingdom of Congo had these slave markets before we turned up, and the people of Congo, well, probably just the king mainly, profited enormously from selling slaves to all comers. I mean, from all over the place. Also, larger numbers of slaves went east to the Islamic world and to India than actually went to the Americas. Slaves were never allowed in Europe, but even during the period when the slave trade existed. So certainly people were making profit offshore involved in the slave trade. But I don't think that you can say that. And the other great myth is that it's a race thing. In fact, slaves were mostly from West Africa, were mostly black people being sold by black people to both black people and brown people and white people, and then taken off all over the world. In the Islamic world, as I understand it, one of the things they used to do a lot is unicize their slaves so that they couldn't breed. And one of the reasons why you have a big black population in the Caribbean and the States is because the slaves that were taken there did breed and were freed and did have families. And there they are now, a very large population.
Well, we saw, touching on America there, we just saw the statue of Christopher Columbus ripped down in a pretty similar fashion as the one in Bristol. And I was on Twitter the other day having an argument with some raving lefty on a George Galloway tweet, and one of the points I made to him was basically, where does it stop? Have you ever been to Rome? Rome's a beautiful city, and there's thousands of statues everywhere, and that's what makes Rome. It's a lovely city. I mean, but if you look at Rome and the history,
yeah. What are you going to do? Rip it all down? Rip down the Colosseum? It was built by terrible slave-owning, slave-trading, monstrous people, monstrous dictators. What are you going to leave standing? Not very much. So so I think you need to have a little bit more intelligent approach to statues of people that may have done bad things, and all over the Soviet Union, you still have statues up of Lenin. They didn't really get rid of their Lenin statues. Most of them are still there, I think. I've certainly seen many examples of them. And should he be ripped down? Well, bearing in mind the atrocities committed by the Soviet Union against its own people and people from neighboring countries, yeah, I mean, by rights, he should be ripped down, but he hasn't been. And I think in some ways, if you're honest about history and mindful of it, then you can look at statues of people who did bad things from the past and accept it and say that's someone who did bad things, good things, whatever it was. But, you have to accept the history instead of ripping everything down. Where do you stop? Muhammad, all the Quranic and Islamic scripture suggested that Muhammad owned slaves. So what are we going to do? You're going to start saying, mosques shouldn't be allowed because they're, heavily co-opted towards a slave-owning culture. You could do. Where do you stop?
People already are, Richard.
What's that?
I've seen that. I said I think people already are. I've seen people making that argument online quite a few times now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So the problem is that the groups who are trying to set off, who are trying to make a culture war and a race war, go up in flames and really consume Western civilization. What they have their eyes on is this election. It's an election year, and you have this group, Act Blue, who are connected with the Democrat Party, and who, I understand, they deal with all contributions to Black Lives Matter. So I think there is a real tangible connection between the Democrats and Black Lives Matter, and they kept a bit quieter last year and the year before. But it's election years when they like to put on a show. And the death of George Floyd, is sad. But he wasn't a very nice guy. This is a guy who held a gun against the stomach of a pregnant woman while robbing her house. Let's stop pretending this guy was a saint. That's the first thing. The second thing is we don't know what happened in the minutes leading up to his death, and it seems quite possible that he resisted arrest and had to be restrained. And if the policeman who restrained him in that rather ugly way was applying the training that they receive in order to cope with situations where big, strong people decide to have a go, then I think there's a question over it. Obviously, it would be better that he were alive. I'm not saying anything against that. I'm just saying that I've seen, but for instance, in Parliament yesterday, when Priti Patel was being criticised, a group of MPs sent a letter saying that George Floyd was murdered. Well, actually, that remains to be seen, and I'm sure there will be a court case, and we'll find out if he was murdered or not. But usually people are a little bit more circumspect about calling something murder when that still remains to be proven in a court. If they said allegedly murdered, that would possibly be acceptable. But we are talking about a police officer called to the scene of a crime and trying to arrest someone. So I think to my mind, it's calling it murder. I'm not sure is necessarily going to prove accurate in the long run.
Again, the thing is there, justice is being done. The policeman you're talking about there has been arrested, and he is facing charges. And they've just upped the charges. He was on charges of third-degree murder. Now it's second-degree murder. Yeah. They're really throwing the book at him. Yeah. With regards to charges, so justice is being done. So,
I worry that justice won't be done. I worry the political situation will actually determine the outcome of the trial rather than the facts of the case.
Trial by media.
Yeah, and that is the worry. That as you say, trial by media. That the case may not be justly conducted, and you've got to worry about that as well. But of course, people will be outraged by me saying that because Floyd's killer has been already turned into a monster by the press. So, that's going to be.
What do you think will happen then now with with this movement? Because we've seen online the GoFundMe page. The last time I looked, they had raised over 700 grand. It'd be interesting to find out where all this money is actually going. It's not being distributed into local communities and whatnot. That's a hell of a lot of money for these organisations.
Luckily, my suspicion is that many of the people involved in organisations like that are so corrupt that most of the money goes into buying new flat screen TVs and trainers and whatever it is else it is, and paying rent or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a danger that we've got big companies. I saw this morning Sprite, or was it today or yesterday? Sprite coming out with essentially setting up George Floyd as some kind of hero, and everybody's got to wear sackcloth and ashes because of all of this. And it's an absurdity, and they're just profiteering. They're just posturing, and I think that they're reading it wrong. I think many of these companies, like Sprite, for example, are taken in by the media, and they don't realize the extent to which ordinary people look at that and think, what a load of nonsense. And this gulf is widening. We saw it in the 2016 referendum, where the press didn't have a clue how real people felt and the way we were going to vote. And it's increased. And, you look at how they tried to deal with the election last year, 2019, and the same with Trump. They can't believe, the media sit there, and when they have to report these election results, they can't believe that their sort of fantasy world that they live in isn't real, that their bubble has been bursted. And you can see it on their faces. They're just shocked and horrified, and they don't know how to react. And I think that when you look at Sprite doing this, they're taken in by it. They think that the media world is reality, and it isn't. And there's, if you look how they got ratioed after that tweet on Twitter, Sprite. You know, they are losing customers hand over fist, and they don't seem to understand that. They think that by taking this sort of these revolutionary political stance and contributing to efforts to foment a race war, that their customers admire them for it. I will never buy a Sprite again. It's logged in my memory forever now. Sprite is a company that supported the fomenting of a race war, and I don't want to see that race war. All lives matter. I don't want to see black and white people fighting each other. I don't want to see brown and green people fighting each other. By green, I'm not necessarily referring to vegetarians. And you know, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that conflict. I don't want to see that totally artificial division, a funded division by people who have some kind of deep iconoclasm. They want to burn down the most successful society in history. They want to destroy it. And that's who's out there on the streets attacking policemen and attacking statues in Britain and the USA.
Divide and rule. Thanks so much for your time. Let's just hope tomorrow it's nice and peaceful and there isn't any serious clashes and stuff like that, particularly with this new law that they're enforcing now. So if you're caught rioting or causing trouble or anything, you could be sent to jail within 24 hours, apparently. That's funny how they brought it into
they
force.
Keep creeping. It's the ratchet of the ratchet against liberty. They keep just cranking it one more notch towards a totalitarian state, and something's got to give, because we are really heading into a new dark ages at the moment. To cheer things up a bit, one thing I would like to mention is Gerard Batten's tweet in response to Sadiq Khan's message today. I don't know if you saw it. Absolutely wonderful tweet. I want to actually read it. Have you got it with you there?
Yeah, please do read it out. Yeah,
I'll have to look it up. But essentially, he said, thank you, Sadiq Khan, for giving this advice to your followers in Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And they should stay home. If they want to smash things up, they should stay home, and they should smash up their own homes. And he said that their parents won't be very happy with them. But anyway, it's a killer tweet. I'm gonna have to look it up.
Pop it up on the screen. I'll find it. I'll whack it up there so we can have a little read of it.
Yeah, I'll see if I can read it. Hang on. Sorry, I should have been ready with this. But yeah, it really made me laugh, and it's classic Gerard, understated and hitting the nail on the head. With great insight, and I enjoyed it. But what's interesting is there's been a lot of activity on Twitter and social media, highly critical of all of this, highly critical of the government, Sadiq Khan, police, the way all this is being handled. We need to step up and actually confront the universities that proliferate all this nonsense, the schools, all of the institutions that do all this stuff. We need to actually challenge them and tell them, this you can't go on this. We're not going to accept it. And you're going to find, I think, the police already are finding that they're not getting cooperation from people. So that terrible video yesterday of the policeman being beaten up in Hackney, with people standing there filming themselves dancing, filming themselves on their phones, dancing in front of a copper being beaten up, just on the street. It's absolutely mind-boggling. But I think the police need to watch it, because they're losing all their friends. They think that if they take the knee to Black Lives Matter, that suddenly they're going to have an easy time with violent people or drug dealers going to suddenly go, oh, respect for the police. No, they're not. They're going to hate you just as much as they always did. But the difference is that good, decent, normal, law-abiding people like you and me, David, look at the police now, and we really wonder whose side they're on, and we're nervous of them, because we don't know if we're going to get accused of something, or what have we done wrong. I noticed yesterday that nobody went in to help the policeman. I think that some people are probably scared of helping a policeman who's being beaten up, not because necessarily they'll get beaten up themselves, but they're scared that they'll be up for some kind of assault charge in coming to the defense of a policeman, because that's how illogical our system has become. It is Kafkaesque now, and it reminds you of old Bezmenov saying, turn everybody against everybody. you make everything unfair. You make sure that everyone is too frightened to speak up, too frightened to resist the madness. And that is how you bring down a society with a divisive fear that leads to really a civil war between, hundreds of sides, intersectionality, you set everyone against everybody and see how that, see where that gets you. So that's where we're heading into now. And I think it's quite frightening. Here we go. This is what Gerard said. He said, yes, Antifa, please work from home this weekend. Smash up your own place. Mummy and Daddy might be upset, but tell them it's all in a good cause. They're probably descended from slavers anyway. Enough said. Enough said.